Hello everyone, welcome back. Let's discuss now how correcting a current account deficit. Shrinking a deficit requires an optimal policy mix combining monetary and budgetary policy as well as exchange rate adjustment, but also structural reforms. In fact, a deficit boils down to an imbalance between exports and imports, that is, between savings and expenditures. That's easier to say than to do, given that it touches many socioeconomic indicators such as interest rates, taxes, exchange rate, consumption, economic growth, and also inflation. There is a large number of countries which face a so-called twin deficit, that is both domestic, budgetary, but also external, that is balance of payments. These countries will suffer from relatively weak savings and large consumption. If you take the US, for example, the share of consumption in GDP reaches nearly 70% compared with only 55% in the euro area. Personal consumption drives the American economy. In China, consumption accounts for only 55%, and investment and exports still contribute to the lion's share of GDP. Well, there is a limited number of economic policy tools to fight a current account deficit. Shrinking consumption and imports is not an easy challenge. Boosting revenues is also challenging in the globalized market economy, where countries struggle to remain competitive, and improving labor productivity will also take time. So, what to do? Well, there are not many ways to skin a cat and not many ways to shrink a deficit. Boosting revenues or shrinking expenditures, or a combination of both. That will require fine-tuning. To implement a successful economic policy, the toolkit is limited. One can quickly destabilize a country's socio-political situation by jumping on the brakes and stopping the economic engine. Think of Greece, think of Portugal and Spain, where current account deficit adjustment has led to massive and protracted recession. Well, government restrictions are the most simple tool to slow down import. You just need to implement a range of trade restrictions and import controls. But you end up with a trade war due to retaliations from your trade partners. That's exactly why trade restrictions are prohibited by the WTO and by the IMF. However, in 2016, the WTO published a trade monitoring report on G20 trade measures, showing that new trade restrictive measures had reached the highest level registered since 2009. Now, there are many ways to turn around the IMF monitoring regarding import controls and export subsidies. An exchange rate is simply the currency valued in terms of another currency. And a stronger exchange rate will make exports less competitive while decreasing the cost of imports, hence contributing to slowing down domestic prices. And that could boost the competitiveness of import-driven exports outside the country. But a weaker exchange rate, in plain English, depreciation, or even a devaluation, is a most likely policy tool to beef up exports and to decrease imports. However, there are many conditions to make a devaluation a success. The first condition, of course, is to have an open economy, and that condition can be measured by the so-called trade openness ratio, that is the ratio of total trade flows divided by GDP. As we can see on the chart, the larger the market, the less the trade openness ratio. The world average is around 30%, but it reaches more than 100% in the Asian tigers, up to 200 and 300%. The so-called G curve shows that initial impact of an exchange rate devaluation will be increasing the cost of imports, hence widening the trade deficit. Export competitiveness will take time to materialize. Yes, indeed, a devaluation will boost exports and shrink the deficit only if the country can produce and export more, and only if there is a market large enough to absorb the goods produced by the country. And that requires demand and supply elasticities. One crucial condition for successful devaluation is that import volumes do not increase. Otherwise, the higher cost of imports will offset the export stimulus and back to square one. Larger devaluation will be necessary, leading to imported inflation, hence a vicious circle. All in all, one can sum up a number of supply and demand elasticities that have to do with the country's economy as well as with the global economy, demand and supply. To sum up the conditions for successful devaluation, you need not only a positive response of trade partners to cheaper exports, but also a decline of imported goods and services in the country's economy. And that requires a policy mix of monetary and budgetary policy. Let's look at a country like Vietnam. Remember, Vietnam needs to import today to produce tomorrow and export the day after. Well, a dong devaluation will first increase the trade deficit, and it will take a couple of years before the devaluation boosts exports and shrinks the trade deficit. In the case of Greece, we have a very large current account deficit of the order of 15% of GDP in 2008, and that cannot be reduced by a devaluation given the Eurozone. The only solution is an internal or a so-called real devaluation that requires cutting domestic consumption with tight monetary and budgetary policy while boosting export competitiveness thanks to lower labor costs. But that boils down to killing growth with a major recession. In the case of Mexico, there was a very large peso devaluation in 1994, which worked well during a couple of years. But then the Asian crisis of 1998 killed the competitiveness of Mexican exports, requiring another round of devaluations of the peso, hence imported inflation. Interesting to look at Thailand, that devalued the baht in the summer of 1997, triggering the Asian crisis, with a successful reduction in its deficit, but at the price of a major slowdown in economic growth. Now let's look at the impact of a currency appreciation, hence a stronger exchange rate, like in the Eurozone in mid-2017. The consequence will be cheaper imports, hence a decline in domestic prices, decline in inflation. Now, can an appreciation of the exchange rate help control inflation due to cheaper imports? Well, this much depends on the composition of imports and the so-called pass-through between importers and consumers. Indeed, the cheaper price of imports will translate into lower domestic prices only if domestic importers do not increase their profit margin at the expense of consumers, the so-called pass-through condition. The exchange rate pass-through is the degree to which a change in the value of a country's currency induces a change in the price of the country's imports and exports. In the US, a cheaper dollar has little impact on import prices and does not lead to a major decline in the trade deficit. So why a weaker dollar not boost foreign demand for US exports? Well, first of all, a lot of imports in the global economy are dollar denominated. Think of oil, gas, copper, coffee, cocoa. Hence, a lower dollar will not impact on the price of these goods in the US economy nor in the global economy. Finally, let's look at the dilemma regarding the reduction in the US current account deficit. Shrinking the deficit requires a weaker dollar, while financing the deficit and attracting foreign capital flows requires a strong dollar. Given roughly a $600 billion deficit, the US economy must attract around $2 billion per day. Now, where does the money come from? Well, from surplus countries such as the Middle East, China, South Korea, and Germany. Now, let's imagine that surplus countries such as China and Korea start losing appetite for the US dollar assets and decide to diversify the reserves, not putting all their eggs in the same basket. That means arbitrage. Well, bond yields, would jump and the dollar would plunge. US bond yields today, are lower than they otherwise would be thanks to the purchase of US securities by China and other emerging market countries. In 2017, there's a clear reduction in the share of China's holding of US securities, still roughly 20% of US Treasury bonds. And the US trade deficit remains so large that the White House, namely Donald Trump, is using protectionist threats to put pressure on exporters in Mexico and China. But we are no longer in the 1970s when the US could devalue overnight the dollar. In the global economy, the risk of spillover is very large. Competitive devaluations and protectionism can quickly lead to a trade war that is a zero-sum game, or worse, a negative sum game. That's exactly what the IMF is warning. So watch out. Thank you.